with Roxanne.
Yeah. They were ugly sometimes. Yep. I saw a lot of things not to do. Yes. Oh man.
He's the chair. Okay, we're back. We'll now go to Community Economic Development. Michael Lillquist, the chair.
Thank you, Gene. Joining me on the Committee for Community and Economic Development are Council Members Murphy and Vargas. We have one item for us today, sort of a continuation of a discussion we've had on incentives for targeted development forms. We wrapped up a discussion last time. We were talking about incentives for urban center development, and these now are not so targeted at places, but at other aspects of development or economic activity. Ms. Coles, would you like to introduce us further?
Yes, thank you. So as you mentioned last time, the committee and council approved recommendations for urban villages, and now we're moving into these targeted development incentives forms. So they aren't focused on a specific geographical area. They're focused instead on certain qualifying projects that could happen anywhere in the city. And the recommendations in your packet, they have been informed by the recommendations from the CHAT, Affordable Housing Task Force, that I think you're all familiar with. Also, the Mayor's Community Solutions Business Work Group came up with some ideas, and then other community groups and staff have also identified some recommendations. And the three categories that they've been organized under are affordable housing for low-income households, which are generally less than 80% of the median income, innovative housing types, or traditional housing types, as we sometimes call them, are accessory dwelling units and other housing forms that are in the infill toolkit, such as townhouses, carriage houses, that sort of thing. And then you'll see a category that's just general citywide economic development. And I think it's really important to note that there are several initiatives that are underway in both the planning department and other departments that are addressing these targeted areas. So this incentives program is not comprehensive. We have the subdivision ordinance update that's underway right now. That's partially to provide standards for new housing trends and to provide flexibility for appropriate infill and a more efficient use of land. We have the accessory dwelling unit ordinance that is currently being looked at to provide a range of housing choices and updating the rules for when these secondary units may be appropriate. We're replacing the permitting tracking software and continuing the lean process improvements for permitting. And then also we mentioned that the Economic Development Strategic Action Plan will be presented to you later this summer, which is a much more comprehensive look at citywide economic development, and you may see some of these recommendations in that document as well. So I just want to make sure there's a little bit of context that we're not attempting to cover every single thing in this body of work. So what I'd like to do, if you could turn to page 71 in your packet, it's similar format to what you saw with the urban village incentives, where there's this at-a-glance matrix, and then the more detailed recommendations follow. But if we could maybe just start with the affordable housing, I'll run through these with you, and then if you have questions, we can dive into them with a little bit more detail. And again, if you notice on the key, the X is if it's a currently applicable incentive, and we often have come up with some recommendations for how to improve or expand it. And a Y is yes, we recommend this as a new incentive. The affordable housing funding programs, those are David Stahlheim's funding grants, which I know that you recently received an update on that. So obviously continuing to fund our affordable housing projects. No changes recommended there. Density bonus. There has already been an ordinance presented to you, I believe a few months ago. It was the demonstration affordable housing ordinance that is in the process of being made permanent. And as part of that, there was a recommendation to expand the density bonus allowance for projects that are a mix of affordable and market rate housing. So that's going to be coming back to you. That this is an action that's already underway, and that'll be coming back to you, I believe, in the next month or so. Expedited permitting, we brought up this topic up during the Urban Village discussion, that right now, because we're doing that permit software upgrade and the lean permitting improvements, once that's done, we do recommend looking at possibly creating an expedited program for affordable housing projects. The next action is park impact fee reduction. We also introduced this topic last session, that the state of Washington has passed a law that no longer requires the city to backfill waivers of our impact fees. So we can now waive up to 80% of the park, transportation, and school impact fees without having to backfill. And you provided direction to David Stahlheim at that last meeting to bring forward an ordinance to formalize that in the city's code. So that's reflected as part of this work as well. The same would hold true for permit fee reductions. We're recommending an 80% waiver of our permit fees. That is a little bit more complicated because our permit fee structure includes a lot of different line items. So that's something that if you do recommend us moving forward, we want to go into a little bit more detail, and we'll be bringing that, following up that ordinance this year. Pre-approved plans. That is an idea that was presented in the original body of work. The city does have something in place right now that's called a registered plan program, where applicants can come in and have the building department review their plan sets without having a specific site in mind. And that means that when a site is available, that the building department doesn't have to review it again. That's something that we do want to continue doing. Another level of pre-approved plans that we're recommending is for certain housing types that we want to encourage to do a proactive process to hire someone to develop plans that are of the quality and character that we would like to see in the community. So for instance, as part of the ADU update, one action that we're recommending is looking at that process to say, here are some ADU designs that we think are appropriate for our neighborhoods. And we could have them pre-approved by the building department to make it easier for citizens who want to implement that housing form to do in a way that's amenable to the community. And then finally, reduced parking requirements. We are recommending that we bring forward an ordinance for your consideration for an administrative citywide approval of reducing, giving the director the authority to reduce the parking requirement for affordable housing projects that meet certain criteria. So I won't go through the last three are related to that, the fee and impact fee reductions. So yeah, at this point, I'd like to open it up to any questions that you might have about the specific affordable housing incentives, or if there are any that you'd like to discuss in further detail.
Other council members? Terry?
Yeah. Why would we want to eliminate park impact fees for ADUs?
The recommendation for not just park impact fee, but for also transportation and school, and actually it's already in place for school impact fees, is that they're considered auxiliary units and of a smaller scale, and often used by family members that are aging in place and moving into those units. So
well, that's wishful
idea.
thinking, because I know most of them aren't used by aging parents moving into it. Most of them are being rented out, or at least the ones that I know of are being rented out, and they have traffic impacts. They have impacts on parking. They have impacts on parks. Some are rented out to families, not just a person. They have the same effects. It's basically, yes, once in a while it's for family members, but come on, most of these we know aren't being used for that. They're being used, and they can be rented out, and that's okay as long as you have someone living there, but even that's not monitored all that great. But I think the impacts are still there. this isn't necessarily an affordable housing method because you don't, there's nothing about how much is being charged for the rent, because the rent in some of the ADUs on South Hill are pretty damn expensive. And they're pretty nice, but it's not affordable, necessarily set up as affordable housing. So I don't think that that really belongs there.
Well, I'm seeing parking back fee reduction for ADUs in the next section. So can you describe, so what you're talking about is just simply for ADUs, parking back fee reductions. Can you help disentangle ADUs from the housing affordability issue? Because ADUs are often sold as affordable housing, and that's what these incentives are for.
We're looking at the ADU in both the affordable housing package as well as the infill toolkit. Infill toolkit's more about the form, but also being really flexible to get some density into existing neighborhoods where compatible. We also look at ADUs as bringing affordability into the picture for the owner, the homeowner. So having an ADU, having a small rental in your backyard might allow you to stay a little longer in your home, age there, age in place, move to the back, brings in some additional income. So we're looking at it from both points of view, as well as, you know, smaller units being more affordable as well.
Terry?
For adding additional income, that kind of takes away Darby's argument about the aging parent, doesn't it? Yeah. Because they're designed for aging parents, and most of them are used for aging parents and family members. Well, if you're setting them up as rental units, that's not, you know, you're adding impacts.
Jack?
The basic response to that, Terry, would be is that if they didn't age in place there, then they would be renting out an assisted living facility that might be $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 a month. So yes, there is an economic issue associated with that to the family that would see a much cheaper version by aging in place on the property.
I think aging in place on property is fine, but do we put the same kind of incentive on it as for others, because when it can be used and mostly is for other things. I just don't think it's an appropriate use of it.
This is really good. I think we should circle back to that in the next section. But let me just, I have one question on affordable housing section, or maybe two. And if there's anything more on that, we'll go on. So my question has to do with the fact that I notice we're waiving for at least 4 of these things up to 80%. That compares to the 50% waiver we're contemplating for urban village development. So it's a larger incentive for affordable housing. And the key word there is qualified projects in both cases, qualified in terms of urban village, and now qualified for affordable housing. We don't just mean things that are cheaper than average. We have a specific definition for some of these. There's a legal definition under state law what affordable means. Are we going to try to use the same definition for the other incentives that aren't governed under state law? So I assume, for example, SDCs, I don't know if that's covered by the same state law, or is it? How do we feel about the state's definition? Is there some cases where maybe it's a little too strict and we might have a better local definition, or do we have no choices, and we should make them all be the same definition for qualified?
We are, the ordinance has been drafted actually. It's going to be brought to you on the 15th of this month. And we're proposing to follow the state's definition. However, we're also going to be proposing that those projects are consistent with the city's consolidated action plan, meaning we're already funding them in one way or another. So
is that an additional requirement?
Yes, we would not. The state doesn't require that, but what we're going to be proposing is if they're already being funded, as which council's seeing those projects and authorizing that funding, then we can administratively exempt those projects. But we're also going to leave the opportunity for us to bring projects to the council if projects are outside of that. Let's say a for-profit developer is able to figure out how to make it work, they could come in and ask for that exemption, but it would require your review.
So right now, I think the Mercy Housing Project is one that we are funding. It's already defined as affordable housing. If we adopt the proposal in the ordinance, they'll automatically be eligible for this, and they can seek it, and it can be approved administratively. But if there was another project which was not being supported by housing funds, but met their definition in any other way, that'd have to come to this council to be kind of included,
Correct?
correct?
Yeah.
Any other questions? Dan?
Two questions. On the school impact fee reduction, it says that it's currently applicable, but in the notes it says work with school district to adopt qualifying criteria for the standard waiver. So is that in motion, or where is that?
Yeah, there, in the ordinance, I believe it already lists, we'll get to this in a second, with the ADUs is already being exempt from school impact fees. And we do regularly waive projects that can show that they aren't going to have an impact on the school system. What the recommendation is suggesting is that during the next iteration of the capital facilities plan that the school adopts, that we come up with some qualifying language so that instead of coming forward on a project-by-project basis for waivers, that we can make it more clear to those developers that if you have this type of project, then you'll get this type of waiver. So to kind of do some advanced work with them instead of a project-by-project approval process.
Okay, and second question, so these impact fee reductions, the TIF and the SDC and park, what does that look like per unit? What's the number in terms of the savings then for the, or approximately?
Approximately, I didn't bring that sheet. We are bringing that forward to you on the 15th, the details. It's about 10 to 11,000 per unit, and that's for all the fees that we're going to be proposing reductions in.
Thank you.
Any further discussion of the affordable housing incentives? Okay, we'll go on to the next section then, please.
So the next section is under the category innovative housing types or traditional housing types. And these are the housing types that are listed in the infill toolkit. And as you know, the accessory dwelling units, both detached and attached, are being pulled into our existing accessory dwelling unit ordinance, and that is under discussion and review. So that's going to be a separate body of work that's going to come forward. So you'll notice in these recommendations that there's some references to that process. The other thing that we've recognized is that the infill toolkit, we've been documenting challenges with those codes that we've heard from the development community, and you're also aware that the locations that the infill toolkit is allowed are for multifamily zones only. So many of these incentives are conditioned on an update to that ordinance. What staff realize is that incentives might not be the best way to make them happen, but if the codes are reassessed and cleaned up and it's still not working very well, then we would want to look at some incentives for those housing types. So I just want to make sure that that's really clear, and I think you'll see that in the details. But for example, a density bonus is the first one on this list. And what the recommendation from staff is if the infill toolkit regulations are opened up for review, that would be the time to discuss whether or not a density bonus provision would be appropriate. So that it is a tool that could help.
Interrupt briefly. So this is the Economic Development Committee, and we're looking at kind of that aspect of it. But when the ADU ordinance comes forward, or when the infill toolkit comes forward, that'll probably go to the Planning Committee. So we're kind of looking at, you're saying that here's the economic development components, but the actual regulations and revisions that occur will be in a different committee, and they'll be just kind of form-based rules. Is that correct?
So the next one, expedited permitting. Oh, yeah, that's right. Yes. So again, I repeat this quite often in the matrix, is that once we kind of clean up the permitting process with those lien events and the permit software, we are recommending looking at an expedited permit option for these housing types. Infill toolkit was listed just as its own incentive, but again, the recommendation is to, in the longer term, look at cleaning up the errors and streamlining the review process and looking at an incentive package if the market doesn't respond to those changes. Park impact fees, school impact fees, and transportation impact fees, recommending eliminating for ADUs, and Terry brought up the discussion around that issue. As well as permit fee reductions. What we noticed when we were doing this review is there are redundant fees for infill toolkit projects. They're charged for design review and plan development review. That was a staff identified change that we'd like to bring forward, is to eliminate those redundant fees. I already mentioned pre-approved plans. Reduced parking requirements are already in place in the infill toolkit for those housing types. Are there any questions about that package?
Committee members, any discussions on these? I do have a question related to ADUs, and I guess maybe it'll wait for the ADU ordinance. What do we do, what will be done, what is being proposed to be done about illegal, unregistered, unqualified ADUs? I think ADUs are a wonderful housing type. The problem has to do with those ADUs which have been established outside of the approval process. And so it makes it tricky to consider providing incentives for new legal ADUs when you have some non-conforming and unpermitted ADUs. It kind of, I think it's exactly what Terry's kind of referring to. Maybe he's not against ADUs, but he's seen them abused and he's worried about that.
Right.
If I might respond, Rick Sepler, Planning and Community Development. Clearly, we anticipate a number of issues associated with illegal units. Not all illegal units are ADUs, but some can be characterized as being similar to ADUs, separate structures that are rented out. As Council will recall, 2 weeks ago we presented our preliminary enforcement plan, and that plan itself talks about a strategy to deal with those pre-existing uses through a variety of means. And we'll be implementing that. Our hope, however, is to have a lively discussion with you on ADUs prior to implementation. Our concern would be that if we do get into the implementation component on ADUs, to say, well, let's not enforce on that till we sort out the rules. Our recommendation would be, let's sort the rules out first before we start implementation, and therefore we can be consistent. Those uses that, whatever the characteristics could be, that can be converted to legal would do so, and those that cannot would be extinguished consistent with the enforcement plan.
I guess the question is, if there's one of these unpermitted ADUs, are they going to be eligible to take advantage of these incentives that we're considering, no. You know, for the people who play by the rules?
No.
Good.
No. Categorically, you have to be in conformance with all applicable rules to be eligible for any incentive.
Terry?
Yeah. But to clarify, I am against most detached ADUs in narrowed streets, small lot, older neighborhoods. And one of the reasons, and that's why I have a problem with reduced parking requirements when we don't know what the changes are going to be with infill toolkits. One of the concerns with the neighborhoods about detached ADUs and carriage houses has to do with the increased parking when you have very limited parking in the old neighborhoods to begin with. And instead of saying, well, we'll allow this, but we're going to make sure that there's the parking requirements, we're saying, well, if we allow this, we're going to reduce the need for parking when it won't reduce parking. You know, it's going to increase the need for parking depending on how many people live in that carriage house or whatever. And so I've got some concerns with reducing parking requirements for all infill toolkit projects when we haven't, you know, yeah. So you understand what I'm saying? You've heard the complaints. So.
Sure. If I could respond,
Yeah.
We're working in coordination because it would be premature for you to consider any incentives if we're going to propose changing the land use rules. And as we're changing the land use rules, we should be mindful about what the effect might be on incentives. So we're coordinating that. It would not be right for you to consider incentives without the rules being firmed up, and we'll work on our scheduling. As Council is aware, the work just starts after you give direction, and each one of those will need to be developed, and there are many months' worth of work. So our hope is we finish our draft recommendation to Planning Commission and to this body on those uses, and we can accompany it with successively with potential incentives. So
That's good. I just
mindful
want
of
to
that.
make sure these
Sure.
concerns are out there, because I'm hearing them all the time from the neighborhoods.
Thank you. Committee members, any questions? Vicki?
Just a comment. Rick, I know that you are working with the neighborhoods on the ADUs and getting feedback on that, so that's very positive for the discussions that we're going to have. And I think I'm going to wait to see what comes out of the ADU regulation, because I do have the same concerns as Terry. If there's units in the back and then people are driving and more traffic and all those things about park impact fees. Parking. But I would like to see the rules first before we get thoroughly into that discussion. So I'm okay with waiting on that one.
Jack?
So if you have a single-family house and you decide you want to go and do a 1 or 2 or 3 room addition to that house that's currently there, do you have any parking requirements associated with that?
You might. There are more than 3 bedrooms in certain areas have additional
If the
street
total is
requirements.
more than 3 bedrooms? Okay, but
And-
if you had a 1-bedroom house and you wanted to put in two bedrooms, you get up to 3 bedrooms, you wouldn't have.
Correct. If you added a bathroom and the tap was adequate size, you wouldn't have to get a
Okay.
new tap or pay additional impact fees.
But you basically would have the same parking impact as you would with an ADU.
And that's the yardstick we use is if the construct is to consider them as an accessory use or as a typical use, are they on par with other uses? And we'll have to come back and demonstrate that. Clearly, there's no shortage of concern, and we want to be able to address it on point.
Yeah, because it seems like if you put a room addition in there and it has the same impacts as an ADU, then why aren't you charging $10,000 to $11,000 for the room addition just for impact fees?
Right.
If it
And
has
it's
the
a-
same type of impact.
If the community at the end of the process, council determines that ADUs are a good housing type and meets needs in certain portions of the city, you'll have to weigh that against the comparable impacts from single family and other uses.
Yeah.
Terry
The
again?
difference between adding a room and an ADU is you're not adding an additional family necessarily, which in most cases with an ADU, when you're renting it out to a family or couple or whatever. So there is a very distinct difference between adding a room for your existing use, which may be, or an ADU, which is renting out to an existing, another family, which usually brings with it cars.
And I would agree with that if we had a rule of 2, but we have a rule of 3 that we don't even enforce, so it's just sort of.
Councilmember Murphy?
I don't want us to lose focus of the fact that we have so many other incentives going on here that I'm personally excited about, so I hope we could carry on.
Hey, Michael, we should carry on. We only got about 5 minutes and we need to move on.
So what I'm hearing both from our planning director and from Pinky, and I agree with Pinky, is that because many of these are related to ADUs and other things that have to be first those form-based decisions need to be made, and then we'll come back and look at the incentives. Is that the staff's understanding too? There's a 1-2 process, and this is step 2?
Yes, and actually the way that most of them are written are to be contingent upon that regulatory update. What we could do for the comfort of what we're hearing for council is to change all of those that are related to the ADUs to be conditioned upon that regulatory update, and we'll just put a timeout on all of them until that process concludes.
Okay, I'm seeing head nods from the kidding, and I agree. Why don't we go on to the final section?
Final section, most of these you'll see X's. They are incentives that are already in place. One that I would like to highlight, though, that we are pretty excited about is the Special Valuation Tax Exemption Program. That's a tax exemption for historic buildings, and currently it's offered for buildings that are listed on just the local register. One of our recommendations is to open that up for buildings that are on the local or national register. We believe that a lot more people might take advantage of that state tax incentive if the city loosens up our regulations a little bit. So we're very pleased that that came out of this work. And The other one that I think is of note is the B&O tax reduction. Our recommendation is to explore raising the exemption threshold. It's currently at $20,000, and to look at maybe bringing forward a proposal to raise that to make things a little bit easier on our smallest businesses. So,
Committee members? So in response to the B&O tax reduction, I think that's really worth looking at. I think it's important to bring forward some estimates, like how many businesses fall below this threshold, how many would fall below a different threshold, how much foregone revenue. In other words, if we could benefit 5,000 small businesses at a minimal cost in terms of foregone revenue, that sounds like a winner, but it needs the numbers. And then finally, the last item here is wetland mitigation program. I read the explanation and I still didn't quite get it. I don't know what is being proposed at this point? Is that pretty mature or not quite mature yet?
is Ted here? We'll let Ted Carlson answer that one directly.
Ted Carlson, Public Works Department. This is something that the city's been working on for a while, and council and administration have been supportive of. We went through a while back and did a habitat master plan that was kind of the first step in doing this. We've recently hired a staff person to continue looking at a regional approach to wetland mitigation, and there's several different ways that we could go about this. And the one that the city had decided on previously was to pursue the in lieu fee program. It's under development. So it is not ready yet for folks to take advantage of, but we're working towards that. And the idea being at some point we will have identified which mitigation projects where in the city we would like to complete. A program would be in place approved by the regulatory agencies, so the Army Corps and Department of Ecology, and then folks could contribute to in lieu fee. They would pay the city would be doing projects that would provide that mitigation at pre-identified places that provide the most value. So it's a few years down the road, and we'll certainly be coming back to give council updates on where we're at in the process, but it takes several years to work through the issues with the regulatory agencies to get the approved project.
Committee members? So on that one, I'm trying to remember the language that we adopted in the economic development chapter. For the wetland mitigation, is there, I hope there is, a requirement that if someone pays an in lieu fee, that the outcome is as good or better than it would have been if they did the required on-site mitigation? Are we setting that kind of and do the regulators set that kind of requirement? You can't backslide. If anything, you can go forward, but you can't backslide?
That's right, and there's policy language that will have to be developed. It will likely take some type of amendment to the BMC. Currently, we have the sequencing process that starts with avoidance and then, on-site mitigation, the mitigation in the basin. We're going to have to go through that process as we develop the in lieu fee program to see if we need to modify the municipal code to give guidance. Certainly, we'll still have some form of sequencing, and Kurt could probably speak to that in more detail than I can at this point. But certainly, the idea of this is that we get the mitigation that we want that provides the best opportunity for habitat, and we're not looking to backslide, in your words.
So in this section, as you say, many of these are already in play, and the ones we talked about, B&O tax reduction, the wetlands mitigation, they're not ready yet. They will come forward at some future date. But they're looking for, looking for feedback. Is there any concerns with continuing to work on those issues or anything in this section? Okay. Do you feel you've had enough reaction on all three of these sections?
We have, but we would appreciate a motion recommending approval of the staff recommendations in the matrix as amended to reflect the ADU concerns.
Councilmember Murphy?
I move that we approve the incentives for targeted development forms with the, how do I want to say it? Contingent upon the ADU understanding and approval.
We have a motion to recommend approval of this matrix of incentives, understanding that that one section on innovative housing types is really contingent and secondary upon the ADU ordinance being revisited. Any further discussion of the motion? All those in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
I'll bring that forth a unanimous recommendation tonight.
Thank you, Cagney and Lacey. See you guys later.
End of committee.
Okay, we'll take another break before we go to committee of the whole.